not encouraging or advising anyone to modify their firearms. This is for entertainment and educational purposes only. Hey, what's up everyone? I did my best to match this Dawson steel mainspring housing to this MJD Killmonger grip. Let's get into it. First I had to fit the mainspring housing to the grip module. Nothing too crazy there. I made a video about the fitting process. Link is in the description. I knew I wanted to machine this mainspring housing so that the texture of it matched the grip texture a little bit better than the 25 lines per inch that it came with. It also set a bit proud of the back of the grip. If I weren't going to machine the texture off, I would have bought the small grip flat version of the mainspring housing. I think that would be a better fit to these MJD grip modules. Anyways, my dad has a dividing head for his mill. It's like a little 3-jaw chuck that you lash down to the mill table. It rotates and has angle graduations on it. I designed a little jig that holds the mainspring housing. It gets clamped in the jaws of the chuck. The mainspring housing goes in and is retained by a mainspring housing pin. There's a little fitting pad here. I file material off until the pin is a snug fit through the hole in the mainspring housing. I made it this way because the mainspring housing pinhole is a bit oversized and I didn't want it shifting back and forth as I was trying to machine it. At the same time, I made a model of the back of the mainspring housing and I figured out my pattern, then made a drawing for me to reference during machining. My jig worked fairly well. I was running into clearance issues with the dividing head chuck and the spindle of the mill, so I had to extend my bits down using a keyless chuck that was a smaller diameter. First, I machined some longitudinal passes to take most of the checkering pattern off at different angles, but of course this left a bunch of little facets. Then I did transverse passes by rotating the dividing head. It's not designed to be used in this way, but this was pretty light duty machining, so it worked fine. This is not a very stiff setup between the cantilever 3D printed jig and the end mill and the chuck instead of a collet, so it moved around a little bit and left lines and steps between the passes. These cleaned up pretty quick with a file and then some sandpaper. I created the pattern with a 1/16 inch center cutting ball end mill. I did the 5 vertical lines first and then machined all the horizontal lines by once again rotating the dividing head. All these cuts were 20 thousandths deep. I cleaned up the burrs in the grooves with a wire brush. Since I reduced the thickness of the housing, it was now sitting sub-flush of the back of the grip. I marked the grip module with a Sharpie, then went to work with a file and sandpaper to blend the back of the grip into the mainspring housing. Next, I needed to check the magwell fit. The back of the magwell was hitting on the mainspring housing, preventing it from going all the way up in the back. I removed the bottom row of texture from the mainspring housing with a file until it fit. After that, I did a bunch of hand cleanup work at the pattern area and broke all the edges. This whole thing will be media blasted before it's sent out for finishing to turn it black. It'll be either nitride or DLC, not sure which yet. After that, there's a little ledge left between the mainspring housing bottom and the magwell funnel. It wasn't big enough to even catch on a mag body, but it was big enough to bother me, so I took care of that with a file. My mainspring keeper pin was also long because I made the mainspring housing thinner. It was sitting just proud of the curvature of the back of the housing. Can't have that. I shortened it up and refinished it with cold blue. I think this looks pretty good. The pattern looks much closer to the grip module pattern now than the 25 lines per inch checkering did. Of course, the best match would be if I was able to machine it like the mainspring housing that came with the grip module, but this really isn't feasible to do without CNC capabilities. It's nicely blended and contoured to match the curvature of the grip and down in the magwell. The magwell is such a nice fit back here now. Listen to the click. Oh yeah. It's grippy, that's for sure. It digs into you, but it's not quite as grippy as I would like. If I were to do this again, which I probably will at some point, I would do 4 vertical lines and increase the spacing of the horizontal lines to make slightly larger blocks. And I would cut the grooves 30 thousandths deep. I would also just knock off this bottom row in the milling machine if I knew I was running a mag well. There's plenty of room on these to take the pattern off and make your own. See how much material I still have left between the grooves and the mainspring bore? That's as close as those two surfaces will get up here at the top, because the axis of the bore diverges from the rails and back surface. I took 50 to 60 thousandths off to remove the pattern, and then I went 20 thousandths deeper with the grooves after that. You can see the vertical line spacing is not quite the same between all the cuts. I think that happened because the radius of this is not consistent. And I think that is due to the hand file work that I did to get the marks left over from the transverse machining. I think the modifications I made to this mainspring housing really capture the time and attention to detail that I want to dedicate to my builds. Maybe it just highlights my specific type of autism. But between fitting, designing, the machining jig and pattern, making the drawing, machining, and handwork, I probably have 10 hours into getting the mainspring housing how I wanted it. That's all I got for this one. I hope this was interesting to you in some way. Thanks so much for watching. I'll catch you next time.